Рад всех приветствовать.
I welcome all of you here at our session, which is entitled Economic Reforms in Russia, Impact of Tax Policy in Oil Industry on Social and Economic Development of the Industry. My name is Denis Borisov, Director of Moscow Oil and Gas Center, Ernst & Young. And once again, we are going to be discussing this very important topic. It's always very interesting when we talk about taxes in the oil and gas industry. And now I would ask our technicians to help me with my slides. But first, I'd like to suggest that we all vote for a certain question, and I do it before we hear the key speakers, and that's my intention, and I hope you all have voting devices. And could you show us the question, please? Here's the question. It's on the screen. I hope you can all see it. I just want to take a picture of that. Only the Ministry of Finance people got the voting device. The Ministry of Energy, perhaps. I think the results are quite obvious, and the only right answer is D. Well, I hope we can talk about the sampling and whether it's representative or not, but we see in this voting that all the latest changes of the tax system and in the oil and gas industry obviously, many people think that it was good for the budget, and we can argue with that opinion. We can find other arguments who else won as the result of what was happening. But if we talk about the tax system, it's important to understand that in principle, this tax system impacts this trinity of the consumers, the budget, and the oil and gas companies. These three factors interact with one another. If we reduce the taxes, there's more cash flow of the companies. They may invest or may not invest these funds into new production. It creates new tax base, and then the overall economy wins and the budget because it gets new taxes. But the key point here is how we look for the right balance. Here we have all three components of this trinity. We have the Ministry of Finance, represented here by Alexei Sazan. We have the representative of Ministry of Economic Development, represented by Deputy Minister Rastrigin. We have companies, we have our Ministry of Energy. So this is what we are going to look at today. And all our experts, whom we will give the floor towards the end as we are discussing this topic, and they can make their valuable comments. We are almost done with it, and let me show you a couple of slides. A couple of more slides. Our attendance is quite good this morning because taxes are important for the oil and gas industry, and they are important for the projects. So if we can show the next slide, if we look at this graph, we can see how many are trying to optimize their expenses. They discuss why the use of current methods of multi-stage hydrocracking impact the economy. But if we fine-tune the taxation, it impacts the end result even more in terms of break-even points than some revolutionary changes. For Russia, taxes are important because oil and gas revenues are so important in our budget. We have all these countries with the share of oil and gas taxes in the budget, and that's why we cannot copy systems of other countries, because the risks of mismatch and errors in the fine-tuning of the system are more sensitive for Russia. Another problem here is historically how our refineries were being developed, where the refineries are located, the distance they have to transport their petroleum products, and our average refinery, with all the European prices, due to those logistical challenges, they cannot really compete with Western refineries. And gasoline prices in the last 10 years, we were able to make it closer to the inflation rate. But if it were not for VAT excise, the gasoline prices could be even higher. No, this is the objective picture. And once again, the overall growth was within inflation. It was based on the growth of taxes. And the next slide here is the key slide that is going to be an important vector in our discussion. The level of taxation in Russia in terms of how much of revenue we take compared with other major companies. But if we look at the right-hand graph based on the profitability per weighted capital, it's not that bad for the Russian companies. There's a system of dualism. It's just the situation today. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. But let me now give the floor to a person who requires no introduction. We all know him and his professionalism. I was always surprised. In Ernst & Young, besides oil and gas, we have coal specialists and metallurgists, and all those people appreciate the professionalism of Alexei Sazanov, who is a real expert in every industry, not just oil and gas. As the host of this panel and representative of the Ministry of Finance, why don't you have some introductory words and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong? Master of the panel, as you call me, it has dubious meaning, but I'd like to thank everyone who is here in the room for inviting the Ministry of Finance invitation and taking part in this panel discussion. Thank you very much, and I hope that this discussion is friendly and constructive. In reality, I'm going to devote my presentation to three sectors: refinery, petrochemistry, and production of oil. I'm going to tell you about the thoughts and position of the Ministry of Finance with regards to the development of those three industries. And I will start with something positive. Anton Siluanov is not just the Minister of Finance, but first the Prime Minister, who is responsible for the development of the economy and growth of investments. Accordingly, in the last year, we took a closer look at those sectors where one can get additional investment potential and there's some added value, some additional product that could be generated and that leaves Russia for whatever reasons. Refineries and petrochemistry were the two most obvious industries where that investment potential has been implemented. I will start with the refining industry. Here in 2011, thanks to Sergei Kudryshov, who is actually present here, quadrilateral deals have been signed to upgrade and modernize refineries that had been stagnating since the Soviet times, with the exception of Lukoil, and investments went into the refining industry of hundreds of billions of dollars, and we got light petroleum products up by 7 to 8%. But starting with 2015 and 2016, the investments in the refining industry have slowed down. Some explain that by our tax maneuver, but crack spread was reduced and the oil price went down, but the investments into the refining industry slowed down. They were even smaller in 2018 than in 2011, even though the price of and value of dollar doubled and most of the equipment is purchased abroad. So the real investment was only 1/4 of what it was planned originally. The output of light petroleum products slowed down. It was obvious that we need to relaunch the investment process in the refining industry. 62% of production of light petroleum products is very low. In Europe, it's around 75–80%. In the U.S. refineries, it's up to 90%. And the fuel oil that's leaving Russia, fuel oil is cheaper than oil, and even when we refine fuel oil, that would be much better. And this is a complicated formula, but together with the Ministry of Energy, we've been working on this issue, and this complicated formula is what we suggested. This is how we calculate the average. This is the additional ratio to the negative excise of 0.3, and those 1.3, and those refineries that are ready to invest up to 30 billion will get this coefficient. Any refinery of the Russian Federation that already gets a negative excise, if they sign an investment agreement with the Ministry of Energy and reform this, has the right to get this coefficient. What we expect from this measure? We expect the growth of investments into the refinery to up to 1.3 trillion rubles from 20 until 2024, more than 200 billion rubles every year. We expect deeper refining to grow, and the output of light petroleum products will go up to almost 78% by 2025. According to our estimates, when this is all over, in today's prices, the additional product will amount 400 billion rubles every year. The next industry where the situation was much worse than in the oil refining, Sergei Kudryshov didn't have enough time to deal with it. It wasn't nearly as good. If we look at this schedule of the expansion of this graph showing pyrolysis and not dehydrating, but pyrolysis and use of raw materials in petrochemical, Sibur and Taif, only these two enthusiasts invested into petrochemistry. My colleagues from Sibur may correct me, but the entire world since the early noughties of 2000s had kept investing into pyrolysis. Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and China. If our growth was under 1 million tons, over globally the growth was up to dozens of millions of tons. And even though we have lots of raw materials, ethane and liquefied hydrocarbon gases and naphtha, it did not increase. This is how much of added value product we kept losing, and now these spreads are up to about $400 per ton. This is the spread that you can earn by processing petrochemical raw materials into some petrochemical products, plastics and resins. And here, together with the Ministry of Energy, we realized that there's a significant investment potential, and we offered a solution for new capacity for pyrolysis of ethane. We are going to offer the negative excise of 9,000 rubles per ton, which will work starting January 1st, 2022. The Ministry of Energy, and I don't have an estimate of what additional investment growth we are going to get, and it's going to be up to 25,000 rubles per ton. That's a very good result. And at the end of my presentation, I wanted to talk about oil production. It's not criticism, it's the attempt to explain the position of the Ministry of Finance, why we have such hot debates with regards to giving new benefits to the oil industry and why we have the position that we have. In the next slide, I will try to look at the oil industry from the outside. If we look at this graph, we can see how many benefits were given to the oil and gas industry and how much of that is expressed in the oil production in the Russian Federation. In 2013, we're talking about 460 billion rubles, and this preferential oil's share in the Russian Federation was up to 27%. By 2018, the share of preferential oil went up to 50%. And all these benefits and preferences that the oil industry got was up to 1 trillion rubles. There are no other industries in the economy with comparable subsidies. If we look at the long-term trends in our assessment together with the Department of Revenues, we expect by 2033 the share of preferential oil will increase to 90% in terms of the total taxable oil production. And if at the price of $60 per barrel, the preferential oil will amount to 2.3 trillion rubles. These are huge numbers. Now we're talking about preferences and benefits, but before that, I was telling you about oil refining industry and petrochemistry. Does it give us any additional investments or any additional product, value-added product for the Russian Federation? Here is how much preferences, how much in subsidies they received and investments in the oil production for 5 major companies in the Russian Federation. As we can see, even if we give more preferences, it doesn't lead to the growth of investments.
It would be logical to ask where these benefits go if they do not entail the increase of investment. Next, we took the total investment of the biggest 5 companies and we compared them with the total operation income and EBITDA of those companies. And here we can see where these preferences go. Investments do not change depending on the amount of preferences provided, and mostly it's not the amount of preferences but the oil quotation that influences the investment. Perhaps sometimes it is also political and geopolitical situation, but otherwise we see that the investments remain stable and the amount of preferences make the industry more profitable, and then those profits go for loan repayment, for dividends, but not to investment and not to the creation of additional product. Next slide. So in the long term, what will be the results of the actual preferences? I'm not now speaking about the new ones, but about the existing ones. What will be the result in terms of the basic oil and gas income of the budget. By 2024, we will lose 0.5% of income. By 2030, we will lose 1.1% of the GDP. Taking into account the current budgetary income, it is around 500 billion by 2024 and 1 trillion by 2030. The current budgetary expenses at a level of 32-33% of GDP actually represent an optimal level for the developed countries, so that they do not lag behind in terms of social and economic development. So neither in 2024 nor in 2030, reducing the budgetary expenses of 32-33% of GDP will not yield any results, so we will not do that. So we will have to find sources of compensation for the existing expenses. I'm not offering any specific solution right now. I cannot say what will be these sources of compensation. I just suggest that we think about that together when we talk about new benefits, and that explains the position of the Ministry of Finance. Why do they oppose it? Why do they want to revise the current benefits? Because they don't impact investments. Yes, today we have the budget surplus, the sovereign wealth fund is increasing, but often people overlook what the Ministry of Finance is saying because now everything is going well. But the decisions of today will impact the situation in 2024 and 2030. The oil benefits will not go anywhere, and in 2024, 2030, in terms of macro situation, the situation may worsen, and then all the decisions regarding the benefits that we have already taken will have to be paid for by someone to support the budgetary expenditure at the level that we have reached. This slide is representing some food for thought. When we suggest any new benefits, we have to keep that in mind. One day we will have to pay for that in 5 or 10 years, not today. Who will pay for that? It's not yet clear. If we are offered new benefits, at least we should be offered solutions at the same time. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention, and it's just some food for thought for you. Thank you, Alexei. I think that when we start the discussion, some questions will be asked to you, in particular by speakers. So before switching to the discussion, I think it would be right to listen to Pavel Sorokin, Deputy Minister of Energy of the Russian Federation, so that he presents his vision of how the 4 tax systems that we have in the form of reverse excise tax, in the form of the additional income tax, in the form of other aspects. So in terms of tactics and strategy, are there most crucial things that should be discussed? Maybe some decisions have to be taken urgently, or what we have today should develop gradually. And since Alexei is talking about long-term prospects, and in terms of strategic development of the industry, what are the steps that we need in order to improve the tax system? Pavel, you have the floor. Thank you, Denis. As Alexei has said, I also hope that we will have a peaceful discussion. The first 2 subjects mentioned by Alexei, petrochemistry and oil refining. And by the way, I would like to thank the Minister of Finance, because we have been working closely together on those subjects, and we may have some breakthrough in those subjects. President has set some goals in terms of investment into GDP, and this is probably the only industry that has some projects with high ROI that can be implemented to achieve those goals. So it's petrochemistry and oil refining. These will yield the results that will benefit our children and grandchildren. By the way, I wanted to ask whether you can put my presentation. I have sent an updated version, and there are some interesting figures there. I would like to start with refining. We all remember last year how difficult it was because we have entered into a new stage of life of our country. Thanks to the efforts of the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, we managed to stabilize the ruble exchange rate that made the economy more predictable, but at the same time that increased the dependency of the internal price on the external oil price fluctuations. Before it was compensated, now it's no more the case. So thanks to the efforts of the government and companies, we have created a system that was first criticized, but now people see already that this system may look a bit clumsy, but at the same time it allows to maintain the profitability of refining at an acceptable level to avoid the risk of deficit. And I believe that this is a very important result. The next stage is the investment coefficient and the finalization of this modernization that was started. We are observing a big excess in refining capabilities, and consumers want to build refineries on their territory. I mean, China, India, the Middle East, because they do have raw materials there, and they would like to subsidize the creation of refining capacities. And this creates a certain predicament for us due to our geography. That means that if we want to increase the added value, if we want to refine our products to the maximum level, we need to create a compromise in terms of profitability. This is a very important picture. It is a quintessence of what Alexei has mentioned. Refining is good. But even if we can see the improved conditions, the increase of value of refining is 15 to 20% if we produce 80% of light petroleum products. In terms of petrochemistry, this increase may be higher. And I'm speaking about big volumes rather than small ones. In that segment, it would be difficult to deploy the system because there is no market. And we face, again, those logistics issues as usual. And if we take methane, for example, every year we're burning about 12 million tons of methane that could be used for pyrolysis. We are also producing some other products that are not used as efficiently as possible. I'm now speaking in particular about liquefied hydrocarbon gas. So we want to preserve the actual balance in the economy and at the same time create an incentive to use the liquefied hydrocarbon gas in pyrolysis. I believe that soon, together with the Minister of the Finance, we will suggest some specific measures to improve the situation so that we have some projects implemented by 2024 already. Speaking about investment, using the basic support measures, we may have 10 million additional tons of raw materials. It's about 5 to 6 million tons of methane, but also some liquefied hydrocarbon gas. Of course, the potential is even higher. We have such projects as Ustyugud, Amur, Ustyuga, some projects in the Caspian region. We also have a number of potential projects that could be supported and then launched, and the results and investments will be comparable. These figures are actually huge, and as I have already mentioned, that's a unique sector that has such a potential. So we have to work there. And we are already working together on that in order to guarantee clear and transparent conditions for the next 10 to 15 years so that we could implement such projects. Our goal is to understand that in 20-25 years, a certain stagnation of demand on oil may start. We may also witness the decrease in oil demand. Our goal is to maximize the value of our reserves, to accelerate and to deepen the monetization and work throughout the chain of upstream, downstream petrochemistry so that when this competition starts, more expensive producers are at risk and not us. The main segment that we are discussing quite actively is, of course, oil production. In oil extraction, we witness a certain point of crossroads. I partly agree with what Alexei said. Indeed, we do face those challenges, and the questions of the Ministry of Finance are quite apt, but we need to take into account a number of other factors. Please put on my presentation. Let us consider the oil and gas industry today in Russia. 60% almost are exported, half of the budgetary income, 20% to GDP. To the right, you can see the economics of a typical oil field. So 40% are taken by the budget. We have experts here today, but nevertheless, I'm mentioning that. Then $10 go to operational expenses and transport just to ensure logistics of this oil. Then, out of the remaining small amount of about $15, we need to spend from $5 to $10 on capex because we need to ensure constant drilling to ensure the constant extraction. Of course, there are fields that have different figures, but I'm now mostly speaking about Western Siberia. That's the picture that we have on almost all the fields. So also $6 are represented by loans and interest, then go dividends, and as for the other money, it has to be used to develop. What we see on the left part of the slide on the graph is done using the $25 that are spent on OPEX, CAPEX, and so on. So the preservation of the industry as one of the main investors and one of the main drivers of industry and infrastructure, as well as IT, is necessary. Actually, the tech companies represent 30% of the market of IT. So IT is still funded by the anchor customer, which is the thermal fuel and energy complex. That's why we need to work on that further. Another graph, I'm not going to dwell on that. This is the dynamics over the last 10 years. The question is, where does the money go and why the investment into production does not increase. The tax system was good 10 to 15 years ago when we were leveraging the potential of the Soviet old system, but now the situation is different. Here you can see the costs for oil production. They have increased by 2.5 times. The water cut is increasing. The drilling speed is increasing, but not sufficiently. The flow rate is going down. So the flow rate reduction by 25% means that for the economics of a well, it is a catastrophe. It has to be compensated by something. Basically, everything has to be somewhat compensated so that the investor is still interested in continuing the operations, and the water cut of new wells increased by 9%. It means that much more money has to be spent to bring oil on the surface. At the same time, what can we say about our resources? This is the graph that shows the distribution by the size of fields. But what's important is that over the last 10 years, 75% of the fields that were discovered and opened in the Hantam-Sisk autonomous district were small. So these statistics shows that we are discovering new fields, but at the same time they are of lower quality. That means that the Soviet legacy that we have been developing is nearing its end. If we want to preserve the rates of production and growth, we need to adopt some bold decisions. This is a graph. Please don't perceive it as an official forecast. Of course, it's the Ministry of Economic Development who provides us with the official forecast. We are, of course, collaborating with them, but here we can see dynamics in the current macro conditions and the fiscal conditions of our main reserves. We see that after 2021, the production may fall because there are almost no large green fields except for the Arctic potential. Most of them are at the stage of production already or will soon be launched. So it will be difficult to compensate them with a brownfield without the use of new technologies or additional incentives. I'd like to refer to what Alexei was saying about the increase of the share of preferential production. Here we have the same stance. Here we can see that preferential oil represents 54%, and soon it will be even higher, and the non-preferential production will fall quickly. There are all the objective reasons for that. What will be the result? It's simple arithmetics. Of course, dynamics and figures may differ. Sometimes new technologies will appear, sometimes they will become cheaper, so development will become more profitable, but overall, investment will fall because it will not be profitable, and of course, tax revenues will fall. That's just arithmetics. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. These are the stimulation measures that we are currently discussing within the roadmap. You have already heard about them. We are making the inventory of the actual fields to do a feasibility study so that we understand what to focus on in order to avoid the negative trends that I've mentioned. And here I'd like just to show you the minimum effect of the implementation of stimulation measures. 4.3 trillion rubles of investment will have to be completed with the investment into the neighboring industries. Cascade investment will also have to be used.
So additional 4 trillion rubles of investment, and they will give us eventually from 8 to 9 trillion by using taxation adjacent capital. I'm not even mentioning multipliers of 2, 3 or 4 times. I'm using the minimum numbers that we can calculate ourselves. Let me also show you some numbers about the efficiency of preferences that were issued 10, 12 years ago for exhausted fields and the preferences of 1 trillion rubles in 2018 for preferential production gave us 1.7 trillion rubles of additional taxes. That was a good payback if we look at it from the point of view of taxes. But the growth of production for preferential categories since 2006, if we don't look at the exhausted deposits and fields, if we forget about them, the increase of production was 85 million tons. This is what we would never get without those preferences. These were additional investments, additional taxes. And if we talk about depleted fields, that's additional 80 million tons, and that's where you also the development of those fields continues and the taxes are paid. Those were quite efficient decisions, and now together we will have to make very important decisions, because in the next 15 to 20 years the development of our country will largely depend on how much our fuel and energy complex will generate, how much investments and taxes it's going to generate, so that we could get send this huge financial resource in the right direction. It's of critical importance. It's not about confrontation, but it's about trying to find an optimal solution, even if sometimes it looks like we have totally different positions. In reality, it's not true. The discussion is much deeper, and it's a joint debate compared with what it might seem to be, and we will find a way out. Thank you, Pavel, for your very detailed presentation with lots of numbers and facts. To continue this discussion, let me give the floor to Pavel Karchevsky. Pavel Karchevsky, advisor to the Director General, head of Department of Work with State Authorities, Gazprom Neft. I will also have a rather peaceful tone, closer to the Ministry of Finance than Ministry of Energy. In the last 10 to 12 years, we've been using all these weird words, and we even forgot the meaning of some of those words, and we don't really recall what that is, and we don't remember what we started with. And these are the taxes per ton of production. We had all those reforms, and in 11 years the tax load, nominal tax load, is what it was in 2009. From the point of view of regular brownfield without any preferences, we have the same situation that we saw 11 years ago. With the refining industry, it's much more complicated. There's obvious drop of subsidies and profitability of the refining business. Many people say that the maneuver somehow deteriorated the profitability of production. It's not true. The key decisions were made in 2011, the system 60, 66, 90, 100. If we hadn't done anything in 2017, 2018, the profitability of refining would be even much lower. Here I'd like to thank Ministry of Finance for making those decisions on time and relatively quickly. But given all that, the production, what's happening in production, it's getting more and more expensive. We have to drill more and more wells, and this graph shows how much more drilling we have to do. In the last 10 years, it almost doubled. Yes, the technology is cheaper. Yes, we know how to work with our fields better, but this trend is dominating. Alexei has shown us some numbers. They may not be so clear. According to our estimates and the entire industry, starting from 2013 when the crisis began, the investments into the industry almost doubled. The EBITDA in 2018 increased some more. We were not able to digest it completely in 2018, because you cannot start drilling as soon as the price went up to $70, and the ruble rate went down by 10 rubles per ton. But the trend in investments repeats the changes in our EBITDA, and that's one thing. And another thing is there are more and more preferential categories. That's true, and since drilling and production getting more expensive and you cannot stop it, there's nothing one can do about it. And if we respond to our original question, whether the beneficiary was the Ministry of Finance or the companies, it's a draw, because the tax level is at the same level, but the actual rate decreased. Here, if we talk about the refining industry, we really support what's happening with the investment coefficient, and using all the experiments in the past, we took the money from the refining to give it to the production. We had 60-66, the exchange of the margin of production to the preferences in production. Now we have exhausted this, we have depleted this resource. Now the margin of a refinery is 700 rubles per ton. When the maneuver is over, the refinery will be loss-making. It will be using 2 subsidies and 1 negative oil excise. And there's nothing we can do here. In the future, refining cannot be a source of any to cover the revenues the budget is losing. Now, what I would like to understand and see, how the government views us, how the fiscal authorities look at us in 10 to 15 years. The foundation of those decisions will be implemented 10 years from now, is laid today or 1, 2, 3 years from now, and then it will be hard to change the situation. That's the only document in terms of this fiscal law, the budget or fiscal forecast of the Ministry of Finance. It shows us some strange numbers. On the one hand, ruble prices on oil are not growing. At the same time, the budget revenues from the oil and gas industry have to grow by 2 trillion rubles, which contradicts any logic, even if the preferential categories are going to grow. In this situation, it's not very clear how the government is going to follow this particular graph, and maybe they will do something with taxes. But the first thing that I'd like to say is that we want to understand where we're going in terms of our fiscal policy. And the second thing, it's more about the Ministry of Finance, and this has been shown already. 1 trillion rubles worth of preferences and new preferences that are being discussed now. There's an additional trillion, and this number, even this number, may not be enough for the government. We want to understand whether it's enough or not. If it's not enough, we need to look at how to increase production, how our interaction with OPEC, whether it is possible or not, whether it will these relations with OPEC will become more important than the price. We are also concerned with this graph, because the more preferences we get, at some point it may lead to the increase of nominal rates, which is not good for the industry or the country. And in conclusion, let me say that regardless of any tactical solutions that we are discussing right now, uplift and things like that, we also need to understand the long-term shape of how the industry is going to develop and what kind of tools are going to be used. Sometimes the tools begin to define our content, and it's wrong. In 2009, we reduced the tax load on everyone, or tax burden for everyone, and we get some results. But it's over simplistic, and we need to get better tools of how to get this rent back, to redistribute the revenue of upside downside between the government and the industry. That's our systemic approach to the industry. Thank you. Okay, we will get a chance to respond after everyone presents their opinion. Some ideas may be similar, but before we go back to the industry, we heard in almost all presentations how important it is to invest into the industry. Our president has set us the task to get our GDP up, and investments are important here. That's why we have with us Mikhail Rastrigin from the ministry that is responsible for investments and how they impact the Russian economy and GDP. That's why my question is to Mr. Rastrigin. He is Deputy Minister of Economic Development. What about your ministry? The investments that we get from the oil and gas industry, how important are they for the Russian economy? The taxes are a tool of redistributing the cash flow within the industry. Is it good enough for the development of the industry and the economy? At the same time, we don't want our budget to suffer. Has this balance been found, or are there any deviations? Thank you for your invitation to present here. I'm relatively new here in this kind of audience, and I've never presented at oil and gas panels before. But of course, we are part of all those discussions when we discuss taxation and preferences. Of course, we need all investments, not just in oil and gas. But the oil and gas industry investments are particularly important because they amount to quite a significant share of about 17% last year. Unless we find the balance that you were talking about, unless we use it in such a way that it stimulates the growth of investments, we won't be able to get to the goal that we have in front of us and in front of the entire country to increase share of investments to GDP to 25% by 2024. And we won't be able to do that. When we talk about the trend in the different oil and gas sectors, it's quite sad. The investments into production in 2018 dropped by 5%. Exploration is down by 5%, and these are not good news. And there was no growth in the industry. It means that the balance has not been found, and the tools that work today, of course, they allow us to deal with some last-minute tasks to bring back and to delay the growth of petroleum prices. That's why we have all those negative excise and things like that. But overall, in all those different segments, the situation is far from stable, and external changes of the situation, the changes in the oil prices in the global market can bring us back to the situation when a certain segment will be losing and getting the margin which is not enough to stimulate further development. And we will have to switch back to manual control, and they will not stimulate the investments, will not attract investments, because we need a flexible public system that works well with minimum intervention of the regulator into the activities of the company. So far, we don't have any such system, and it should be based on the floating excise and the floating changing component of the mineral extraction tax. And now about the revision of preferences that was mentioned here. The overall direction is good, is well chosen. It should not be delayed, but in our opinion, I really enjoyed the presentation of my colleague from Gazprom-Neft, who said that we needed some fine instruments that will create equal conditions for the investment profitability for projects with different production situation in terms of capex and investment expenses. It should all be based on benchmarking involving maximum amount of companies. If we don't get there, it will be hard to get the kind of system that we need. And in conclusion, let me get back to the topic that was briefly mentioned here this afternoon about what we decide on what we call non-systemic taxes. A few years ago, there was this additional component of mineral extraction tax. They promised that it's only temporary, and today we're discussing the extension of that component, delaying it and making it permanent, or delaying this decision about making it permanent. It prevents us from increasing investments into the oil and gas industry, and we won't be able to reach our target in terms of investment share in the GDP. And my final thought is this. The criticism that we hear towards oil and gas companies, that they have this huge income and EBITDA is growing, but there are no investments. Well, that fact is true, but these investments, they don't necessarily depend on the current situation or current revenues, but rather on the profitability of projects that are treated by the oil and gas companies. And this is a regulation system. It doesn't allow the companies to make investment decisions, and that's okay. It means that no matter what our income is today, it doesn't mean that they will lead to additional investments. It means that we need to discuss the adjustment of our fiscal system and giving guarantees that this system will not change
due to any changes of the environment that will allow to attract investment to the oil and gas industry and give an impetus to economic growth that we expect. That's it for me. Thank you very much, Mikhail, for your professional comment. I think that everyone will agree with me that in the dialogue between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economic Development, your position will be important. So thank you for it once again. Now, Alexei and Pavel have already spoken about the risks that exist for the future budgetary income due to the preferences. And Mr. Alec Perro, head of Lukoil, mentioned that the excess profit tax that started this year and the extension of its perimeter is an important step. So I would like to ask Alexander Kuzmich-Matitsyn, first Vice President of Lukoil, whether now already we can sum up this pilot project or that experiment. I believe that we can call it like that because the perimeter of the excess profit tax is quite reduced. Thank you, Denis. I wanted to make a small disclaimer as I'm speaking on behalf of the company. First, I agree with everything that the representatives of ministries are saying. That's one of the very interesting discussions this year, because here we consider the country's interests in the global perspective, the interests of industry as a integrated mechanism, and the fact that this complex of measures is considered as an integrated one will help us to develop most efficient solutions on this subject. The only thing I wanted to mention is the following. When we speak about benefits, we have to divide them by several categories. By benefits, I understand a different distribution of profitability in the same conditions. We all know that the fields are depletable resources. Unfortunately, they have their own life cycle, and we cannot produce oil like people produce sausage all the time from various materials. So it is a resource that can be depleted. Fortunately, the developing technologies allow us to produce more and more oil in the fields that have already been operated. There is a classical example of Chevron that took a 100% water cut field and is using new technologies to produce oil there. So new technologies exist, but they need investment, as it has been said. I'd like to say a couple of words now about the excess profit tax that we have been talking about, and it is now working as an experiment. Currently, we have 29 sites that work like that. 2.4 billion tons were produced there, and a part of them, 8 million tons, were produced in the West Siberia fields, which are mature ones. The production increased by 8% and the drilling speed by 20%. So thanks to the switching to the regime of excess profits tax, we are expecting the increase of investment by 60 billion rubles. That is to say, 3 times higher than at the current regime. We expect the increase of production by 30% in the nearest future to compare with the current tax regime. So these are the results over the first 6 months. Of course, the fields behave differently, but this is our result. Lukoil has only old, mature fields, especially in West Siberia. So our goal is to slow down the production decrease rates. And the excess profits tax is a classical win-win situation. It's beneficial for both the state and the company. And it represents more than 200 billion rubles. The amount is significant. And this approach that we were able to start using is just the beginning of a big journey. It's not a benefit, actually. It's a possibility to produce oil at the same fields and distribute income in some proportion between the state, the budget, naturally, and the company, because under regular conditions, we would leave that oil in the soil. But these are the fields that are already developed. They don't need roads, access roads, and other infrastructure. So it reduces the amount of investment necessary for their development. That's a new approach. That's the increase of the tax of the oil production coefficient. It's a function of investment and technology. In other words, to produce more oil, we have to find new methods, new technologies. Many of them were absent in Russia. And the very scientific and innovative development that is also of interest to the government is giving a big multiplication effect. It may create a big stimulus so that these technologies could be indeed developing. And the experts are now forecasting the oil and gas revenues by 2030. And that increase can be achieved through new investments, new technologies, and we have to be very attentive to the coefficient of oil production. Now, regarding refineries, just a couple of words. There were some very good thoughts voiced about stimulating investment into deepening of the processes. We just have to remember those who have already been doing that without investment. I'm not now speaking about additional preferences or benefits. We would like to avoid inequality in terms of economy. I just wanted to say, don't forget about us if possible. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexander. Alexei has already spoken about the role of Alexander Kudryashov, General Director of Zarubezhneft, who was Deputy Minister of Energy at some point. And many bases of the current system were laid by him 10 years ago. So I have the following question to you. You had some ideas 10 years ago. Which of those ideas were implemented? And how correct was that path? What are the things that failed? And maybe now you have some other ideas regarding what could be changed and how to move on. So the main idea is what about taxes. Taxes represent a tool to conduct a policy. 10 years ago, our goals were set and we wanted to achieve that goals. The first goal was to understand why at the maximum prices production fell, and we wanted to develop tools that would help us to invest. We experienced some issues. For example, for 5 years we have almost not had any new fields. The goal was to increase the efficiency of the current fields. Second, there was a deficit of quality fuel in the country, and we did not meet the Euro 4 and Euro 5 requirements. There was no incentive to invest into deep refining, and we also needed to work in such a way in order to avoid tax losses from budget and in order to maintain the prices. As we have seen, there was a more than 40% increase in drilling. There was no production drop experienced by the country. Many new fields were put into operation, which allows to further increase the production. Now the question about refining. The amount of investment increased several-fold, and we managed to meet the challenge of Euro 4 and Euro 5. And there is no issue of the lack of the respective fuel. Regarding the pricing policy, as colleagues have mentioned, over these years, due to the inflation period, to the excise taxes, we experienced no catastrophic changes. So basically all the goals that were set are currently implemented. The question is what to do next. I would like to go back to the idea that taxes represent an instrument so that we understand what we want. We want to maximize the effect of activities of the state and of the companies. There are two things that determine the further development. First one, current status. Second one, world trends that currently exist. A couple of words about the trends. It has been said on various occasions today that there is excessive supply on the oil and gas market, which can lead to some serious price issues. Another direction that was not mentioned is energy efficiency of internal combustion agents, as well as switching to e-vehicles. We see that in Europe for a dozen of years already we witnessed the decrease in the consumption, and they represent our main client. Pavel has said that there is a trend, in spite of new technologies, of reduction of flow rate, increase of water cut, and reduction of efficiency of the new wells. We also witnessed two negative trends. It's the reduction of the processing rate, and the second trend, no matter what people say, is a reduction of the new wells putting into operation. Before, we witnessed an intensive growth, and that led to the increase of the GDP of our country, but we now see a slowdown in that area, and we have to understand where we have some possibility to increase production. Maybe we could develop some new region next to Timur. Maybe we could look there. Then we should drill more densely, and maybe we could consider some possibilities to extract more in the gas field. So we need now to understand what should be our goals to achieve maximum effect. I'd like to wish everyone so that in 10 years we gather here again and conclude that we managed to set those goals and achieve them. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sergei. As always, your answer is very structured, precise, and it's particularly pleasant for me to hear about goals, because now I'd like to give the floor to Sergei Kamyshanov, member of the board, executive director of Sibur. As Alexei has said, as Pavel has said, petrochemistry is probably one of the goals that we should achieve and develop. Of course, there are some other issues there related to the competition increase. But since we're speaking about taxes here, from the point of view of the stimulation measures that were already taken, I'm speaking about the reverse excise tax, for example, or the launch of new projects that require some incentives regarding reverse excise taxes on methane and liquefied hydrocarbon gas. So, Sergei, could you share your vision of the implementation of your projects and their relations with the tax system? Good afternoon. Thank you, Denis. I think that our discussion is quite interesting indeed, and I agree with many things, and I will just try to add some more details to what has already been said about the correct approach in tax regulation and about how it can stimulate investments in a significant way. Regarding what Sergei Sazonov has said, I'd like to confirm that the country development over the last 10 to 15 years, if we speak about petrochemistry, was insufficient. We indeed missed some important opportunities for development. There has been a hyper cycle of growth of the global economy. It has an impact on petrochemistry industry development because usually it exceeds the overall economy and GDP increase. But it's not the first mistake of our country, unfortunately. The same mistake was already made by the USSR at the time of development of oil and gas production. And there was another region of the earth, namely the Middle East, who seized that opportunity, and the third center of global petrochemistry appeared in the world. Then the fourth center appeared. It was China. It was based on the growth of consumption, and the Chinese economy growth as the growth of the second economy in the world. So now we would like to seize these new opportunities that our position provides. Sibur is a company with the turnover of $600 billion, and it has invested more than $10 billion over the last 5 years. So actually, we are investing nearly $2 billion per year. This is the investment program that we are conducting, and one of the bright examples of this investment program is the Zapsibneftekim plant. We are now at the stage of commissioning of that plant. It is finished by 80%. This project has cost us around $9 billion. It has a payback period of more than 10 years, and the construction took 5 years. So I'd like to highlight that such mega projects that our company managed to perform to take a lot of time and have a long payback period. This is a project that will create additional 1,200 new jobs at the plant itself. But usually in our industry, the multiplication effect is around 4 to 5 times growth of employment in the adjacent fields. So overall, 6,000 new jobs will be created. It will also add 100 billion annually to the GDP once it reaches its full capacity. And this confirms once again what Pavel Sorokin has said. Indeed, petrochemistry has a big added value. The value that is created in petrochemistry exceeds by 3 to 6 times that in the basic production sectors. Taking into account the scale of the project, it will also add to the non-commodity export of the country. We hope that in 2020 we will reach the full capacity. Can we get back to the initial slide, please? So we will also add 80 billion rubles to the export, and that could ensure 100% plan of a specific year in terms of the export growth. This is part of the national goals and strategic objectives of the Russian development by 2024. Overall, indeed, the changing tax environment is helping a great deal to develop new petrochemistry industries. We as a company are always looking for new opportunities, and we see how much the economy develops or depends on the tax environment. Now, I would like to conclude a couple of words about the new petrochemical complex.
There, in the Amur petrochemical facility, it's processing olefins, and it's based on gas production and the export of gas to China. Thanks to the construction of this Amur gas refining plant, it's treating gas to be sent to China, we can now develop natural gas-based petrochemistry, which could take side products of the Amur gas treatment plant and turn it into added value products. And currently, we're talking about 1.5 million tons of polyethylene. And of course, it's going to cost us $7 to $8 billion. And the payback of this kind of project would require stable and favorable environment for its payback period. And in this case, it will be more than 10 years for sure. What can the reverse ethane excise do with regards to this project? It allows us to make some decisions about this project in its basic configuration and drastically change the consumption of ethane as one of the best petrochemical raw material in the country. The consumption of ethane amounted to 700,000 tons. This project alone will consume about 2 million tons of ethane every year. Speaking about midterm, long-term prospects, the reverse ethane excise will allow us to use 6.5 million tons of ethane in the gas treatment, which will be equally divided between the Amur project and the Irkutsk oil company project. And then we can also treat additionally 3.3 million tons of ethane. And then if we look at Gazprom and Rusgasdobыча projects in Ust-Luga, Astrakhan and Novy Urengoy, considering this initiative, we are ready for the implementation of the basic scenario of this investment project, but we see other opportunities as well. We see that Gazprom at Amur gas treatment plant, we will get additional LPG volumes, and this amount can be sold as the finished product, but it will not give us any additional taxes or money. It's comparable to oil, but we can also treat it, process it, and turn it into polymers. And now what? It can help us set up the largest manufacturer of polyethylene and polypropylenes on the basis of Amur gas treatment plant. We're working on the alternative, and we're trying to increase it to 2.7 million tons of polyethylene and polypropylene. And this facility will become a truly unique asset and help us to increase our export. When you are in the Amur region, it's not that good for domestic sales, but it's excellent for selling it to China and other countries of Northeast Asia. And there's this reverse excise on LPG. We have signed a preliminary agreement with Gazprom to increase the commodity basket for this facility, adding millions of tons of LPG from the Amur gas treatment plant to the petrochemical plant. We have passed that fork in the road, and we also have this taxation situation. Given the deadlines that we have for the construction, we need to finish it by 2024, and we have a contract, take or pay contract. We will have to make a decision, and we will have to make an investment decision at the end of the year. no later than Q4. We would like to ask our partners from the ministry to finish the preparation work that they're doing now, and thank you for saying it openly so that we could choose a better configuration and work on the largest facility in the world of this class. A few more words about petrochemical raw material in general and this schedule of launching reverse excises in our country. Petrochemistry can use any material. Ethane is okay, but it can be replaced by LPGs or naphtha. When reverse excise is introduced on naphtha, it changed the commodity basket of the Russian petrochemistry. The consumption of naphtha increased by 36%, while the consumption of LPG is down by 10%. It's the direct consequence of tax situation for the processing of naphtha. Liquefied petroleum gases are more expensive to export. It takes about $65 per ton to export naphtha, and when we talk about LPG, it costs $135 to transport the same ton of LPG. It's a totally different type of tank. It's a totally different. These are totally different Russian Railways tariffs. In terms of the entire system, when we introduce the reverse excise for naphtha and we create a certain situation when we stimulate the export of raw materials with higher transportation costs. I'm sure that the ministries understand that, and we do hope that they will have a long-term and reasonable taxation policy to stimulate investments into petrochemistry. Thank you, Sergey. We are running out of time, and we have 4 more speakers, representatives of consultants and experts. I have a very hard task. We have the 3 beautiful ladies and Alexei Kondrashov next to them. Many of you know him as one of the authors of 6066 system. Alexei, if you could be very brief about it, and the same request to other colleagues. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I will not take time away from our beautiful ladies here. Just briefly about what was expressed here. Responding to Alexei Sazanov, I have 2 big wishes. When we compare the taxation system of today with what was built in 2003, and when we think about anything else as preferences, this is wrong. I think that the fact that the preferential production is growing means that the system is too outdated. And another point, I have a major request to almost all here, and some of this has already been expressed. Here's my request. Stop calling this additional income tax a preference. This is not a preference. This is a new taxation regime which the oil industry will be using in the Russian Federation stage by stage. There's no other way. You don't have to have all these numbers. This is how the world is developing. We looked at about 100 taxation systems, and we think it's the right way, given the time and place where we are today. This additional tax is already in use, and this additional income tax, it works. And here's my comment. We see fairly serious opportunities to optimize the development plans, so that on the one hand we could use all benefits of additional income tax. On the other hand, we could use our subsoil in an optimized way without deteriorating the situation at those fields. This is not just about taxes. This is not a task only for taxation services. It's also the agencies that are responsible for exploration and production. We need to really coordinate these plans very well as we communicate these results to the ministries. Now, a few comments about oil processing. I am convinced that the system that's been created, and mathematically it's correct, and with all the dumpers and all this, our temporary things usually exist for quite a long time. Look at the current taxation system, but nevertheless, perhaps we could also take this excise at the final point of sales. Since we were moving away from it, I know that, but we were at a very different level of IT. The IT of today allows us to do that, and the fact that the Federal Tax Service is advanced in terms of their IT division, that's a good step forward. Going back to production, every taxation system is operated based on 20-25 years cycle. After we fully switched to the additional income tax, this is not something new. This is a tool invested in the 70s or 80s of the previous century. Today, when we have this fast growth of the digital world, when the digital twins are used for individual wells, sooner or later there'll be other ways of taking royalties, and this looks like science fiction today, but this additional income tax once looked at as science fiction as well. This is a separate topic. It's worth separate discussion, and that's what we need to be discussing with companies. And thank you for your attention. If we look at the previous Vedomosti newspaper archives in 2011, many of what he wrote in 2011 has come true today. So you'd better listen to him when he talks about numbers. Let me give the floor to my colleague, Marina Belikova, our partner from Ernst & Young. And Marina will cover anything that has not been mentioned here today, what we really need to improve our taxation system, considering the global experience that we know so well. Thank you, Denis. Almost every year, the same question is asked about what is good in other countries. Maybe we're missing some trends. From the point of view of petrochemistry, it's useless to look at what's happening. There are so many special features that we have, and what we have is really special. And when we talk about exploration and production, it's useful to look at the global experience, whether we want to recognize it or not. Many countries are fighting for the investor capital. If a certain country has projects with good geology and offers a good taxation system, it's only logical that that's where the investors would go. To say that, we cannot say that countries are all going in one direction, but here are some additional points. The tax reform in the US was a true breakthrough when they reduced their profit tax to 21%, and for specific projects which were already good enough in terms of the geology, they also reduced royalty, which increased the interest of investors to their system and projects, and at the same time we have to realize it gave them some benchmarking, and that's what works in Mexico, Colombia or Brazil. We could compare our system with the numbers offered by other countries. Another trend is this. It's obvious that in latest years the countries are trying to monetize their reserves, and some African countries and the Middle East countries want to stimulate the exploration in their countries because the investors don't come. There's no single simple method for that. It's about the overall situation in their economies, but if we want to stimulate exploration, some countries have taken some positive measures. That's how it is. We have to recognize that the reduction of demand for hydrocarbons is a real risk, and we will have to consider this fact of competition for the investors when we continue to adjust our tax system further. During the panel discussion, even Mr. Graf, who had to learn about the oil and gas industry problems recently, was talking with a bit of emotion about how the country needs stability and taxation. Investors try to understand whether they can invest into long-term projects, and the situation changes every year. Of course, other countries change and adjust their tax systems too, but they have very different tools of joining the projects, concessions and other tools. It's all approved at the level of those documents. Since we don't have those tools, we need to make a decision about our long-term strategy and not changing it if we can. Making an inventory will help us determine where we need to go and what kind of parameters we could focus on in the long-term prospect. Thank you, Marina. Let me give the floor to Daria Kozlova from Vigon Consulting. She is a well-known expert. She is she's involved into all the calculations and inventory making and calculation of excise. And what about you? Was there anything else that the previous speakers missed and what you want to focus on? I want to thank the speakers, and these were excellent numbers and slides.
I think that all the taxation issues of the oil and gas industry have been discussed today. Are there any listening devices here? Because that would allow to develop a whole concept. Well, I would like to speak a little bit about the oil production. It's very nice that we are converging in our views. We've heard the Ministry of Energy, representatives of companies, and their speeches have shown that the current taxation system is dissatisfying for both the state and the companies. And the tax differentiation should probably become a sort of a platform to revise everything that exists in the industry. I'm not going to speak about this transition to the excess profit tax. Many things have been said about that already. I wanted just to say that we see that the key issue provoking such discussions stands from the lack of data on behalf of the government, and the inventory is showing that the actual system of the state expertise is not helping to reach this goal. And I believe that one of the main conclusions that could be drawn based on the inventory is the transformation of not just the taxation system, but of the whole environment, including the state expertise. Thank you very much, Daria. Before Alexei and Pavel sum up our discussion, by the way, at the Oil and Gas Forum, they already stepped on thin ice, but here we are having a more peaceful discussion. So before that, I would like to give the floor to Victoria, partner of KPMG. Thank you, Denise. If we speak about the production sector, the goal is not to provide benefits like the dog that walks the tail that walks its dog, but the main goal is to ensure the adequate production rate. We have those figures written in the forecast by the Minister of Finance and the energy strategy. There is also the potential of some new projects, including the Arctic cluster. Yes, this potential does exist, but these are capital-intensive projects because this territory has no infrastructure. It basically has nothing. And when an investor takes a decision about whether he should invest there or rather in a different project, he will use the profitability index, and the excess profit tax will not fully resolve this issue. That is why we are discussing the necessity of adequate tools, because we want projects to develop. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. Pavel, based on the things that we voiced, how do you think? Maybe you want to add some comments or focus the attention of our listeners to something in particular. Thank you very much. Our discussion has been quite interesting. At the beginning, there was not enough time, and I did not say everything I wanted, but colleagues complemented it very well. So I would like to draw a general conclusion based on what Sergei said. He structured very well the goals to reach that could serve as an orientation for us. We have discussed some stimulation measures. Yes, these are specific decisions in specific areas, but the main goal and the main issue is that today oil and gas is a source of rent. I don't know how many years we still have, but this will end. And we have to be prepared for that. All the participants of the panel have spoken about that. Costs increase, competition increase. That is why the profitability will decrease. It will be the result of those factors. Everyone in the world understands that. The Middle East has reserves for 70 to 100 years, but they also have to monetize that, and they will be able to do that quicker than us. So the profitability will reduce. When we are answering the question about what should be our orientations, first of all, we need to understand that the structure of the state profits will change, either through the reduction of production or through other factors, but we need to transform the oil and gas industry and the fuel industry in general into a driver for development of industry, education, and so on, and to make sure that we have supply in all of the segments. And I cannot but agree with the idea that benefits just represent a differentiation of the taxation system, and it all depends on our goals. Over the last 1.5 years of work, we've had some difficult points and acute discussions because the situation is changing quickly. But I'm convinced that soon, together with the Ministry of Finance, we are going to reach consensus on these issues, and we will be able to synchronize our ideas with the energy strategy so that we have an integrated plan of action that we will try to stick to. I have no doubt about that. Thank you very much, Pavel. Alexei, as far as I understand, the Ministry of Finance will probably not ban the words tax breaks or benefits. We are waiting for your final remarks. I'd like to thank everyone for having stayed with us till the end. The point of consensus today is that the oil and gas industry is the systemic industry of Russia, and it's important to support it. But the answer to the question who will pay for the preservation of that industry was not found. To conclude, I'd like to highlight that it was aptly mentioned that the oil and gas reserves are a resource that can be depleted, as well as the patience of our people. So I would like everyone to remember about that. Thank you for your attention and have a nice day. Before everyone leave, I would like to ask you once again to vote and to answer the questions that will now be put on the screen. So the question is simple: whether your opinion about who was the beneficiary of the tax system has changed. There are two options: yes or no. Okay, we see that you are quite conservative. The turnout is high, the result is unambiguous. Thank you very much once again.